Want to be a part of our show? Send us a voicemail via our brand new 24/7 hotline for our podcast. Dial 845-208-5677. That's 845-208-5677. And your message could be featured in the next live episode of the Mets Weekly Podcast. Last week, we saw publicly our owner, Steve Cohen, be very, very public, very upfront, very transparent in the situation, talking about his displeasure for the negotiations in regarding Pete Alonso. To give the Cliff Notes, talking about how pretty much it's up to Pete, defending what David Stearns was saying, a very passionate crowd of Mets fans at FanFest last Sunday, and for very good reason, of course. There were some pieces of context where Steve Cohen said that Soto was a very tough negotiation, and Pete, along with Scott Boras, without mentioning his name, this is even worse. So it does say a lot of what the message that they have been sending to Pete Alonso and Scott Boras. And ever since then, we did get a report from John Heyman, one of the main sources of Boras clients, saying no more than 48 hours after publicly lamenting the seamless endless saga, Cohen was back in conversation with Alonso's camp. The Mets are still in play for Pete Alonso, but money remains the obstacle, and a resolution for him isn't imminent at this time. Pete desperately wants to return to the Mets, while the Mets have no problem going in another direction if they can't close the gap in negotiations. We had some other stuff from Pat Ragazzo, who has been on fire this offseason. He said that the Mets are back in talks with Pete Alonso, and there is a belief that some progress has been made towards a reunion. The chances of Alonso returning to Queens appear to be have risen since Saturday's public show and tell from Mets owner Steve Cohen about how exhausting the negotiations have been, pretty much reiterating what was heard from John Heyman. We've heard the Blue Jays, we've heard the Angels. Bob Nightingale said that the Blue Jays have really been Alonso's only other serious suitor, and if Alonso really wanted to sign there or anywhere else on a short-term deal, it likely would have to have happened already. It seems almost inevitable that Alonso will return to the Mets. Like we said, we pretty much know that Alonso is most likely coming back to the Mets. We just don't know when. Pretty much every single report that we are seeing come out and unfold in regards to Alonso's market, we have said many, many times before, continuing to repeat ourselves. Andrew, I will give the mic to you. He desperately wants to come back to the Mets. That's very, very interesting to me. Very interesting, and let me tell you, in terms of the market, once again, I did not see this coming whatsoever.
Of course, he doesn't want to go to Toronto. Shocker. Nobody wants to go to Toronto. Surprise on, Max, they got Max Scherzer yesterday, so you got to love it. They're trying to compete. But again, it's to the point the market is small. GMs are smarter. Nobody's going to pay a one-tool athlete anymore. You're not going to get term unless you are a five-tool athlete or unless you're 26-year-old and one of the greatest hitters in this sport. To the point of, again, we're exhausting every week, saying the same things. And again, we all know this is going to get down and probably going to happen. You know what? Probably on Valentine's Day, because Pete Alonso loves the Mets and loves Mets fans. Why not do it on Valentine's Day? There you go. Bring it back. And we still have 2 more weeks to talk about this guy for just being, and then he can come back and break all the records. So at this point, again, there's no market. It continues to be no market. You see the Astros are probably going to get Bregman back. So maybe how desperate the Blue Jays get, maybe that deadline with Vlad is coming up. If that doesn't hit, if they don't get him extended, hey, maybe they'll be a little more aggressive. But even the reports is they're not even getting to what the Mets offered at the $70 million. They're less than that. So again, Pete, what are you going to do? You are just pissing off Mets fans that you thought Francisco Lindor getting booed his first year back, that first slump after the stunt you've pulled this offseason, and we know how emotionally stable he is, just like his buddy Jeff McNeil. Get ready, Pete, because unless you come out the damn gates hitting 40 homers and go back to that 50 homer guy, you get ready for it. So at this point, it's a waiting game. He won't fire Boras. We saw the reports that other agencies have contacted Pete, and he's staying with Boras. You know what? You reap what you sow. You turn down 158. You've turned down 70. Maybe you turned down 90. What more do you want in life? But guess what? You want to keep playing? I'll see you in mid-July after you play 2 months in Syracuse to get your spring training ready at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there are other pivots out there. They're not the level of Pete Alonso, but we talked about this last week where the Mets already replaced that production of Pete Alonso. All they need to do is fill in first base. So Pete Alonso is kind of just seen as, at current moments, again, not finished product. I get it. There's the Dodgers, there's other competition. He's seen as, okay, if you want to come back, you can come back, but we're not going to do this forever. Frank, I mean, what else can we do besides repeating ourselves? As Truman Quinn says in the chat here, I'm just tired of talking about it. I'm just ready for a resolution, whether he's back with the Mets or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'll add that what I'm curious about, we don't quite know yet, is has the Mets offer gotten better as the offseason has progressed? Like, have they put certain offers on the table? Boris and Alonso say no, and they say, okay, well, now we offer you this, and then they say no. Or have they been very just caught on a certain offer that the Mets will not budge from? Because maybe that's why Boris and Peter are kind of doing the waiting game, saying, all right, well, you know what? We're waiting for that better offer. We're waiting for that better offer. Or, like, it's kind of those things we talk about, like, who's going to blink first? It's like, are the Mets going to increase their offer for them to say yes? Or is Boris and Alonso going to lower their asking price to say yes? So when you get, this deep into the negotiations, and if Pete really wants to be here and the Mets are the true suitor, somebody has to kind of give in a little bit here in order to reach that agreement, because, I mean, clearly what the Mets value him at and what Boris values him at are not the same thing, and that's why they've not been able to come to this agreement. So at some point, someone is going to have to take the step to then make something different happen.
It really just continues to look like it's the Mets just in such an advantage and no one's willing to give in. I'm seeing some people in the chat saying that Toronto offered Pete 6 years. I think they offered Bregman 6 years.
6 years.
And that was the report that did come out. It seems like Bregman's re-engaged with the Astros in that way. A little bit of a parallel going on right now with two Boris clients in Alonso and Bregman. But if it was Toronto or he preferred to come back to the Mets, if the Blue Jays gave him a 6-year deal, he'd be gone by now. And I definitely can guarantee that because no other team is willing to do that. One thing that I do question a little bit in this is the fact that we're seeing Pete Alonso reject as many offers as he can with like pretty much the most diminished market a player possibly can. And the only market that you have is the wealthiest owner in baseball. You've been a homegrown talent here. And if you weren't a homegrown talent here, they probably would not be doing this due diligence. Like we have said, he's declined these last 2 seasons. So the Mets really, to be honest, they should have moved on by now. But it's obviously something that fans do still want, and they still want them to consider him. And until Pete Alonso isn't a Met and he signs somewhere else, fans are going to want to bring him back. This just was not a smart decision. We have had a lot of people pointing the finger at Boris. We've had people pointing the finger at Pete Alonso, people pointing the finger at Stearns, people pointing the finger at Cohen. I mean, it's all really just come into what Pete Alonso wants. And the main reason as to why I continue to say that, I mean, yes, hiring Scott Boras is something that he probably should not have done. Looking back, as revisionist history, of course, maybe he thought he was going to have a bigger year than he did. He didn't. But one thing that we do, I feel like, ignore, Christine saying, of course, he wants to come back. No one wants him. Pete made his own bed. Pete's ego turned down $158 million. He couldn't live on $1 million a year for 58 years. He shot himself in the foot. And we've talked about this many, 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 many times. He rejected that offer, that 7 years, $158 million. He rejected that before he hired Scott Boras. So it's not like Pete is, just getting bad advice here. I'm seeing some stuff about how Brandon Nimmo's the one to blame because he recommended Boris to Pete Alonso or something. Pete Alonso chose to fire his old agent and hire Scott Boras. The difference between Pete Alonso and Brandon Nimmo, you can't really blame Nimmo for Pete Alonso performing like shit. Again, that's like revisionist history that you're just continuing to try to look back on as to where, compared to Brandon Nimmo and Pete Alonso, Brandon Nimmo showed up in his walk year. Pete Alonso didn't.
The greatest homegrown Met of all time is going to go down as the greatest Met of all time. And also, everyone's like, well, just because they paid Brandon Nimmo means, Pete Alonso has to make more than Brandon Nimmo. Brandon Nimmo actually had a market. No, this is the idiots. There's a thing called Brandon Nimmo had a market because teams actually wanted Brandon Nimmo in his walk here. He had Toronto, he had Cleveland, he had other teams involved. Pete Alonso has nobody. He is, I'm not going to make that joke. He's all by himself. He's on an island by himself. Nobody wants to give that man a life jacket. The Mets are here. They have their offer. They're not going higher. They're not going any lower because, again, you're not going to bid against yourself. So if you want to sit on that island, strand and go hungry, good luck.
There was one thing from last week that there was like some kind of offer that Toronto like had when you know there was reports about a deal being close with him in Toronto, that Pete Alonso was the one who basically nixed the offer. And I don't know if this is true or not. It was just something that was floating around. It was like, you know, over the last week, where it seemed like they had a deal and Scott Boras agreed to those terms that they met for Pete Alonso, and Pete Alonso just kind of just basically shoved it away. So again, it all signs really come to it as to where Pete Alonso wants to come back. He's just not going to get his own terms. We've talked about this so many times. It's where, you know, it's either you want the money, you want this, you want that. You can't have both. Again, like he's in a situation where he didn't play well in 2024. So it's like you can't have both. And that really continues to just put us in a staring contest, and also gave us reports that maybe the Mets are just willing to move on, because it seems like they are willing to move on, looking at some of the trade options. Maybe they keep Vientos at first. I mean, it seems like Pete Alonso is just more in a desperate state as compared to the Mets right now, because, you know, the Mets are sitting still here and they're just waiting for Pete to get a better offer. And that was, I guess, what they assumed when they had this whole pivot thing from Andy Martino. But that offer hasn't come.
I think what's going on here is that in the Mets, outside of Juan Soto, do not tend to overpay, whereas so they're asking for more money. But Toronto, as we know, has no problem overpaying. I mean, they've been throwing money at just about everyone that's available this offseason. Most players have turned it down, but lately they've gotten some to take it and sign. So I feel like I'm sure that they've asked for a certain amount of money, and Toronto is much more willing to offer that. And Boras says, okay, that's what we're looking for. Pete, we got it. And he says, no, let's still see if the Mets could somehow be close. I mean, if that report is true, I wonder if it'd be one of those other times where we've seen other players take less money to go to certain teams. I mean, we've seen Trey Turner did it, and we've seen some other guys do it. I wonder if the Mets could just get close in the range. Maybe they'll say yes and turn down. Like, I don't think the Mets really have to overpay here to get Pete to stay, because I don't think he's really looking for most money. I think he just wants more money, but still be with the Mets. If it's just me from the outside looking in based off everything we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, he's just lost that merit to have that. And, you know, I think that it gets really blindedly looked at from the free agent market. You know, Mets fans, you know, they see it as the guy who's been here for 6 years, the guy who could possibly break the franchise home run record, the guy who hit 53 home runs in his rookie year and had a historic year, 40 home run bat. To the rest of the league, it's looked at as a guy who's declined over the last 2 years. It's looked at as a guy who is a first baseman who doesn't play the best defense. He's not as bad as said, but he's still not great. Not a great base runner. He's, you know, he's a single tool heavy first baseman. That's how he's viewed as on the market. The Mets are only going to value him more than any of the other 29 other teams. The problem is he does not have that GM that was here to give him the 7 years, $158 million. He has a guy who right now who is looking at it in terms of player value, because Pete Alonso is not in that top 1% of, you know, Aaron Judge, Juan Soto, Shohei Ohtani, Mookie Betts. Like, he's not in that department. So the fact that, you know, we continue to have this discussion of, well, they're willing to pay Juan Soto, who wasn't even here, and they're not willing to pay Pete Alonso, what gives? Again, it's like right now, what is the competition in order to go that far for it? You know, I understand wanting to get this thing done, but there really has not been anybody else that has challenged them. The Mets even said publicly, reported it. I don't know if it came from just Andy Martino's mouth and he just ran with it, if it was true or not. They publicly said, we are willing to move on now. They spent some of the money that went into the luxury tax bill. They said, we're willing to move on. We have talked about Mountcastle. We have talked about Torkelson. We saw a rumor about Anthony Rizzo today, which I don't think is going to be that materialized. We saw even a non-guaranteed contract be offered to Mark Canha, who can play first base. Like, there's been other options that have been explored by the Mets, and he still has not been given an offer. The Mets even tried. They even said, we're going to back away here. We're out. We're done. He still hasn't gotten an offer that, I don't know, he can't refuse or outbids or whatever. And to what Frank just said, it's like, it seems like he wants to come back to the Mets, but he also wants, money that other teams are not willing to shell out. The Mets can't really shell out, more money just because he's a homegrown guy, just because they have a fill-in at first base. Because the Mets are right now, they don't have to overpay just because Steve Cohen has the money. It's also something to come to, as we've talked about it before. I think it was last week. If they were to overpay and give him $30 million a year, that would end up being like $48 million in luxury tax threshold. You're going to give $48 million or spend $48 million of the luxury tax and, go to all of that trouble to give it to a first baseman who, as an overall player, maybe he's the fringe top 50 or something. Yes, he's a hitter. He's a big hitter. He's been a big hitter for 6 years now in this organization. But there has to be a cutoff here. And again, if Mets fans, like we've said, if he doesn't like it, he should have played better in 2024. Anthony Santander is the exact same age as Pete Alonso. He got a 5-year deal. Why? Because he showed up in his walk year. No one's going to give that term to a first baseman. I'm not trying to say that he's aging, but there has been a decline in production. I think we all can say that. Phillips saying he's like a 2.5 win player. I do not think that they are very much worse going into the season without him. And listen, this is the thing. I think overall, when you look at the lineup as a whole, maybe it is a little bit top heavy as of right now. And you don't want Brett Beatty in the lineup. I don't want Brett Beatty in the lineup. But the thing is that the Mets have gotten into these situations where they're overpaying for guys for what they could possibly offer going forward. The Mets have to kind of look at this from the angle of, what is he going to do going forward for us? How are we going to pay for this upside? What is what he has earned, or what can the Mets actually find a way of common ground here, which most likely will look like an overpay. Brett Beatty sucks. We all know it. That's not a good backup plan. Of course, I think we've all talked about it, of how the Mets do need to add in another bat to this lineup, whether it is Pete Alonso or whether it is somebody else. Somebody said in the chat, I don't know who it was, Pete is already on thin ice right now. Again, like Andrew just said, if Pete Alonso, were to struggle like he did in 2025, if he comes back after everything that has been pulled in this offseason, the stunts that have been pulled, after all of this, he wants to come back, but it seems like he doesn't want to sign a contract, and it's just a staring contest. And it seems like he was holding up a lot of this offseason, depending on the time that you're talking about it, depending on the timeline before they signed Winker, Minter, or even brought back Stanek. It's really just up to Pete Alonso. Like, what does he want to do at this point? Because the Mets are willing to move on. They've said that they're willing to move on. And at some point, you're going to have to do something. I don't know if that's going to end up being a trade. I don't know if that's just going to have Brett Beatty in the lineup and they address it at the deadline. From our good friend Ibby from Till Mets Do Us Part, saying that this is going to last into spring training in hopes that a team suffers an injury, ups and downs, and it ups the price tag. Boris is stubborn, and he is going to go that route. It's very, very possible that that does happen, because we've seen it happen before. as to how these guys kind of hold out the way that they do. And I feel like eventually these tricks and these types of things, even though there's a track record beyond Scott Boras, front offices are just getting smarter in this regard. And there's some that aren't desperate, some that are. And then the ones that are desperate doesn't seem like a real attractive place. It seems like Toronto, the only competition right now, it seems like their priority is probably locking down Vladimir Guerrero Jr., like we've said. Because like right now, when it comes to Pete Alonso, you know, unless he matches his 2019 season, the Mets will probably end up moving on after a year anyway. So it's not like, you know, it's not like he is 100% in this future plans because he's been here for 6 years. You know, I think that, you know, there's some Mets fans out there that, you know, are just ready to let him walk. They're ready to let him do that. He's still an option out there, and that's the reason as to why we are still talking about it. If his market hasn't been so poor, we probably would be moving on by now. How Mets fans can have any sympathy for Pete is beyond me. It's just insanity. And that's the thing. It's not even just something of like telling fans how to fan or telling fans how to do this or telling fans how to do that or criticizing fans. It's the fact that how I view it, and I know Andrew kind of views it like this. It's like, I don't know Pete personally. You know, he doesn't know me personally. It's not like I need to be, you know, fully emotionally attached to this whole situation because, again, Pete Alonso, no matter what, if he does play next year, and he most likely will because he's not hurt like Conforto was, he's going to get his money. He's going to get the top 1% money that ball players get that every typical person dreams of. Again, and that's the main reason as to why business shouldn't be personal. I understand the personal attachment to it. He's a homegrown guy. People look up to him and whatever. But you just never know. Want to be a part of our show? Send us a voicemail via our brand new 24/7 hotline for our podcast. Dial 845-208-5677. That's 845-208-5677. And your message could be featured in the next live episode of the Mets Weekly Podcast.